Hey everyone, I'm Liz Fairy and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how I made these lilies out of crochet. Some things you'll need for this project are a crochet hook, I used a size E. You'll also need a pair of scissors, a stitch marker or bobby pin, a yarn needle, and the yarns I used for the flower were Rich Orchid from Loops and Threads Impeccable, Rose from Karen 1 Pound, Baby Pink from Red Heart Super Saver, and White from Red Heart Super Saver. I also used cornmeal from Red Heart Super Saver and gold from Loops and Threads Impeccable for the stigma and stamens. And I used spring green from Red Heart Super Saver for the leaves and stem. To add speckles to the lighter pink portions of the flower, I used some DMC pearl cotton embroidery thread in the color 718, which perfectly matched the rich orchid pink color. To sew the speckles, I used an embroidery needle, and I used some craft wire to give the leaves and stem some structure. This wire is 22 gauge. If you'd like to follow along with this project, you can find the written pattern, as well as all my other patterns in my Ravelry store at the link in the description. Before I begin, I just want to discuss the weight of the yarn that I'm using. I'm going to be making the flowers using worsted weight yarn, but I actually think the best way to make flowers like this so that the petals look light and delicate is to make them either with a fine weight yarn or with split apart worsted or Aran weight yarn. They are kind of ridiculously huge and bulky in the worsted weight, especially the stamens. I would have tried using a finer weight yarn, but it seems like they just don't have that many in stores anymore except for in super pastel baby colors, which would work for certain flowers, but I think they look better with a bright, vibrant color, and you can only really reliably find colors like that in either worsted or Aran weight. So I prefer to make them with split apart yarns, but in this video I will be showing you how to make them out of the worsted weight yarn because it's a little easier to see what I'm doing. But if you want that pretty, light, delicate petals look, I suggest either using finer weight yarn or using split apart worsted weight or Aran weight yarn for the flower. For the leaves and stems though, I just used Aran weight yarn. I'm going to start using my darkest pink shade of yarn, which is the dark orchid color. I'm going to begin my work with a slip knot, and I'm going to leave a long tail at the beginning of the work, which I'm going to use to sew the two layers of petals together later. So I'm going to make a slip knot, then I'm going to chain one for the center foundation. This is the chain that I'm going to work all of my petal foundations onto. To make the actual petal foundation, I'm going to chain 12 more. First, I'm going to chain 1 and mark that as the first stitch of my row using my bobby pin. Then I'm going to chain 11 more so that I have a total of 12 chains for my petal foundation. Then I'm going to slip stitch into the third chain from the hook, then slip stitch into the next 9 chains until the only chain I have left is my center foundation chain. Alright, I've finished with slip stitching into all of my petal foundation chains, and now I just have my center foundation chain left, so I'm going to slip stitch into that chain. Now I'm going to repeat that process 2 more times, making 3 petal foundations total. So chain 12, slip stitch into the third chain from the hook, and then slip stitch into the next 9 chains until I get to the bottom of my petal foundation. Alright, I've gotten to the bottom of my second petal foundation. Now I'm going to slip stitch again into that first chain that I made, the center foundation chain. Now I'm going to repeat that one more time, creating a third petal foundation. So chain 12, slip stitch into the third chain from the hook, then slip stitch into the next 9 chains until I get to the bottom of the petal foundation. Now I've gotten to the bottom of my third petal foundation, so to finish this row, I'm just going to slip stitch again into that center foundation chain. Now I've created all 3 petal foundations. So next I'm going to create my petal. First I'll slip stitch into the first stitch of the previous row, then I'll mark that stitch as the first stitch of this new row. Next I'll slip stitch into the next 2 stitches of the row. Alright, I've slip stitched into the first 3 stitches of the petal foundation. Next I'm going to single crochet into the next 8 stitches until I get to the top middle of my first petal foundation. Alright, I've finished with 8 single crochets, and now I'm at the top middle of my foundation chain for my first petal. Now into this top middle stitch, I'm going to single crochet 5 times into the same stitch. Now I'm going to continue along the other side of the petal foundation, so I'm going to mirror my stitches. Into the first 8 stitches of this side, I'm going to single crochet, and now into the last 3 stitches of the petal foundation, I'm going to slip stitch. So that's the first row of my first petal done. Now I'm going to repeat the same thing into the next 2 petal foundations. So into the first 3 stitches of the next petal, I'm going to slip stitch, then I'll single crochet into the next 8 stitches, Now I've gotten to the top middle of the second petal foundation. Into that top middle stitch, I'm going to single crochet 5 times into the same stitch. And then I'll mirror the stitches on the other side of the petal foundation, starting with 8 single crochets into the next 8 stitches. And then I'll slip stitch into the last 3 stitches of this petal foundation. Now I've finished my first row of my second petal foundation. Now I'll repeat the same thing into the third petal foundation. So slip stitch into the first 3 stitches of the petal foundation, single crochet into the next 8 stitches, single crochet 5 times into the stitch at the top middle of the petal foundation, mirror the stitches on the other side, starting with 8 single crochets into the next 8 stitches of the petal foundation, then I'm going to slip stitch into the last 3 stitches of the petal foundation, but on the third slip stitch I'm going to change colors to my next darkest pink yarn, which is the rose. Now I'm going to create another row around each petal using the rose yarn. First I'm going to slip stitch into the back loop of the first stitch of the row, mark that as my first stitch using my bobby pin. Then I'm going to slip stitch into the back loop of the next 2 stitches of the row. And I'm going to work this row around the tails of my rose yarn and around my orchid yarn, just so that I don't have to sew it in later. Now I'm going to single crochet into the next 10 stitches of the row. Again, working over my yarn tails. I won't be working this row over the yarn tail that I left at the beginning of the row, because I'm going to be using that to sew the layers together later. Alright, I finished with 10 single crochets on this side of my petal. Before I go on, I'm going to cut off the orchid yarn because I won't need it anymore. Now I've gotten to the top middle of this petal, so into that top middle stitch I'm going to single crochet 5 times. And now I'm going to mirror my stitches on the other side of the petal, starting with 10 single crochets into the next 10 stitches of the row. Now I've finished with my 10 single crochets, so now I'm going to slip stitch into the back loop of the next 3 stitches. And now I'm going to repeat the same process on the next petal. Into the first 3 stitches of this petal, I'm going to slip stitch into the back loop of the next 3 stitches. Then I'll single crochet into the next 10 stitches until I get to the top middle of the petal. Alright, I've finished with my 10 single crochets and I've gotten to the top middle of the petal. Into that top middle stitch, I'm going to single crochet 5 times. Now I'm going to mirror my stitches on the other side of the petal, starting with 10 single crochets into the next 10 stitches of the row. And now I'll slip stitch into the back loop of the next 3 stitches of the row to complete the second petal. Now I'll repeat the same thing into my last petal, changing colors again at the end of the row. So I'm going to slip stitch into the first 3 stitches, into the back loop, single crochet into the next 10 stitches, single crochet 5 times into the top middle stitch, and then mirror my stitches starting with 10 single crochets into the first 10 stitches of the row on this side of the petal. Next, I'm going to slip stitch into the back loop of the last 3 stitches of the petal, but on that last slip stitch, I'm going to change colors to my baby pink yarn. Now I'm going to work my next row using the baby pink yarn, again working over the tails of the old color and of the baby pink so that I don't have to sew those tails in later. And again, I'm going to leave that first tail out so that I can use it to sew the 2 layers of petals together later. So first I'll slip stitch into the back loop of the first stitch of the row, mark that stitch as the first stitch of my row using my bobby pin. Then I'll slip stitch into the next 2 stitches into the back loop. Now I'm going to single crochet into the next 12 stitches of the row, making sure that I'm working my stitches over the tails. Now I finished with my 12 single crochets. Before I continue, I'm going to cut off my rose pink yarn because I won't need it anymore. And now I've once again gotten to the top middle of my petal, so into that top middle stitch, I'm going to single crochet 5 times. And then I'll mirror my stitches and single crochet 12 times into the next 12 stitches of the row. Now I've finished with my 12 single crochets. So now I'll slip stitch into the next 3 stitches into the back loop. And now I'm going to repeat that process for each of the remaining 2 petals. So slip stitch into the back loop of the next 3 stitches, single crochet into the next 12 stitches, single crochet 5 times into the top middle stitch, and then mirror my stitches on the other side, starting with 12 single crochets into the next 12 stitches. And then I'll slip stitch into the next 3 stitches of the row into the back loops. Now I've finished with 2 of my 3 petals. Now I'm going to repeat the same thing for the 3rd petal and change colors again at the end of the row. So first slip stitch into the back loop of the first 3 stitches of the row, single crochet into the next 12 stitches, single crochet 5 times into the top middle stitch, and then mirror the stitches on the other side, starting with 12 single crochets into the next 12 stitches of the row. Now I'm going to slip stitch into the last 3 stitches of the row, and on the last slip stitch I'll change colors to my white yarn. Now I'm going to create another row using my white yarn, once again working over the tails. This row I'm going to do a little bit differently though. First I'm going to slip stitch into the back loop of the first stitch of the row, Then I'll mark that stitch as the first stitch of the row. Next, I'm going to slip stitch into the back loops of the next 2 stitches, just like I've been doing all along. And now here is where the row gets a little bit different. This whole time I've been just single crocheting into each stitch. In this row, I want to create a ruffled edge. So I'm going to single crochet into each stitch 3 times until I get up to the top middle stitch. So into each of the next 14 stitches, I'm going to single crochet 3 times. And I'm going to make sure that I'm continuing to work my stitches over the tails. So single crochet 3 times into the next stitch. Then single crochet 3 times into the next stitch. Single crochet 3 times into the next stitch. And I'm going to continue to single crochet 3 times into each stitch until I've worked 3 stitches into 14 of the stitches of the previous row. And you can already sort of see that this is creating a ruffled edge. Now I've finished with 3 stitches into each of the next 14 stitches. Before I continue, I'm going to cut off my baby pink yarn because I don't need it anymore. Now I've gotten to the top middle stitch, and once again I'm going to single crochet 5 times into that stitch, but I want to create a picot on the middle stitch of my 5 stitches. So I'm going to single crochet 3 times into that stitch, create a picot, and then single crochet 2 more times into that stitch. So I'm going to single crochet 3 times into that top middle stitch. Then I'll create a picot by chaining 3. Then I'll slip stitch into the 3rd chain from the hook. And now I'll single crochet 2 more times into that same stitch. Now I'm going to repeat the same thing that I did on the other side. I'm going to mirror my stitches on this side. So I'm going to single crochet 3 times into each of the next 14 stitches until I get to the bottom of the petal, where I'm going to slip stitch into the back loop of the last 3 stitches of the petal. So I'm just going to single crochet 3 times into each of the next 14 stitches. Alright, I've finished with my 3 single crochets into each of the 14 stitches. Now I'll slip stitch into the back loop of the next 3 stitches. So I've pretty much completed my first petal, and as you can see, those 3 single crochets into each stitch has created a really ruffly edge. And now I'm going to repeat that process for each of the remaining 2 petals. Now I've finished with my 3 single crochets into each of the 14 stitches. Now I'm going to slip stitch into the back loop of the last 3 stitches of the row. and then I'll just slip stitch to the first stitch to end my row. I'm going to cut off a long tail of my yarn, which I'm also going to use to sew the 2 layers of the petals together later. Now I just need to make another layer of petals in exactly the same way. Now I've finished making both sets of petals, but let's take a little break so the video doesn't end up too long. In part 2, I'll show you how to finish the other parts of the flower and how to make the leaf and stem. If you liked this video, be sure to push the like button or share it on social media. If you made this or any of my other projects, I'd love to see it. You can tag or DM me on Instagram at LizFairy to show me what you've been working on, and while you're there, give me a follow to see what I've been working on. If you like the work I do on the channel and would like to thank me with a donation, you can do that in one of 2 ways. You can join my Patreon campaign at patreon.com/fairyrings, or you can leave a super thanks below the video right here on YouTube. If you want to see part 2 of this video, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and click the bell to receive notifications every time I post a new video, so that you don't miss the next one. That's all for now, so I'll see you in part 2. Bye!